Hi, I'm Ted Wright from Epic Archaeology, and today we're going to talk about the Exodus. We're going to talk about the background of the Exodus, and we obviously believe that there really was an Exodus, that it really did happen, written about in the Old Testament. We've written about some historical things about the Exodus, and at Epic Archaeology, we believe that knowing ancient history really comes from three places. It comes from something that historians call primary sources, and there are three primary sources. There are eyewitnesses, historical records, and archaeological remains. And so all three of these primary sources point to the historicity of an event. So what I'll talk about today is really the internal evidence for the Exodus story. Now, maybe later we can share some other hard evidence, archaeological evidence, but this is internal evidence that whoever wrote the Exodus really understood Egyptian culture. Now, when we read about Stephen in the New Testament, in the book of Acts, Stephen is actually preaching to the Jews. And he mentions in, I believe it's Acts chapter 7, he mentions that Moses was trained in all the ways of the Egyptians, and he was a man of power in word and in deed. So if that is the case, if Moses was trained as an Egyptian, then shouldn't we expect to find things in the Exodus story that indicate that this is a very influential, a text that's influenced by Egyptian culture, and in fact, we do. There's ample, amazing evidence that the story of the Exodus is actually grounded in history from the internal evidence of the text. So one example I want to give today is the example of the hardening of the Pharaoh's heart. Now, beginning in the book of Exodus chapter 7, beginning in verse 14, I believe it is, the Bible begins to tell us about the different plagues. And of course, if you know the story of the Exodus, there are 10 plagues. And so all throughout the narrative in the book of Exodus, beginning in, again, in Exodus chapter 7, the Bible says in fairly different phrases, but it does say it again and again, and Pharaoh hardened his heart. Pharaoh hardened his heart. Or sometimes it'll say God hardened Pharaoh's heart. You know, a lot of us modern readers will look at that and will go, well, you know, he was just being stubborn. Now, obviously, that's true. But what I want you to see right now is I want you to see the Egyptian understanding of this. Now, again, if Moses was trained as an Egyptian, and not only Moses, but also the Israelites who had lived in Egypt for 400 years, then certainly they would have understood Egyptian culture as well. So what does the hardening of the heart have to do with ancient Egypt? What does it have to do with Moses? And what does it have to do with the Exodus? Here's how. Several years ago, archaeologists discovered papyri. These are writings that contain hieroglyphics and stories, things like that. And as archaeologists and Egyptologists begin to understand ancient Egypt, they discovered something called the Egyptian Book of the Dead. And what they discovered in these writings is an amazing story that really gives us insight and illumination into the background of the hardening of the Pharaoh's heart. So what happened is many of you know, and have probably seen on documentaries and films, that the Egyptians would mummify the pharaoh or the dead after they had deceased. And upon mummification, the pharaoh's internal organs would be taken out and preserved for the afterlife. Now, what's interesting is that the one thing that was really examined in the afterlife was the heart. And the heart was very important in Egyptian culture and in Egyptian religion. Now, in one of these papyri manuscripts, they found something called the Ani papyrus, and this actually contained a picture of what happened in the afterlife when the pharaoh died. So here's the scene, and you can see it in the picture in front of you. There's an amazing picture here that we're going to look at, and what you see in front of you is a picture of the pharaoh, and he is bowing down with his wife, and there is a scale balance. And you notice in the scale balance, on one side of the scale, there is looks like a feather. On the other side, it looks like some type of jar. What you're looking at is the pharaoh's heart being weighed in the scale balances against something called the feather of Ma'at. M-A-A-T. And the Ma'at is actually an Egyptian goddess, or the Egyptian goddess of truth and righteousness and order. Egyptian Ma'at concept has a very interesting and very rich meaning. And again, it has a multiple meaning. It's truth, it's justice, it's righteousness, it's order, and all of these things. And one of the jobs of the Pharaoh, his very job, was to keep order in Egypt, because there was always these forces that tried to bring chaos into Egyptian culture or into Egyptian land, whether it was a flood or whether it was plague or whether it was a drought or whatever it was. And if the Pharaoh did not keep ma'at, if he didn't keep order, and his heart was hard and he was stubborn, then he would be condemned in the afterlife. And on one side, on the other side of the Pharaoh, you can see it looks like a little crocodile, and he is waiting to consume the heart if the Pharaoh's heart was found to be hardened. So this gives us some amazing insight into the story now, beginning in Exodus chapter 7, when we read Pharaoh hardened his heart. I think Moses is trying to say here, not only to Pharaoh, but also to the Israelites, because you remember now, Exodus, Genesis, all the way through Deuteronomy was written to the Israelites. They would have understood this story. They may have heard about it. Maybe they read about it. And certainly they would have understood that the hardening of the heart was not a good thing. We see this historically and archaeologically all throughout Egypt. When archaeologists find mummies, what they found is, and they begin to unwrap the mummies, they find these very interesting little small carvings all throughout the mummy. But one of the things they find, and I have an example here, is a scarab. And on one side it looks like a little beetle. On the other side it actually has a hieroglyphic inscription on it. And this is actually a spell from the Egyptian Book of the Dead, and it's placed over the heart of the Pharaoh to keep his heart soft. So we see this with the scarab. There's also something called the heart amulet that is intended to do the same thing. So the hardening of the heart is not a good thing for the Pharaoh, nor is it a good thing for the Israelites. What is interesting about this is that it's almost like an object lesson for us today, that there are some people who, no matter how much evidence you show them, they still will not believe, just like the Pharaoh. The problem is not the head, the intellect. The problem is the heart. So when you go back now and read in the Exodus account of the Pharaoh hardening his heart, it was almost a polemic against the Pharaoh by his own religion. And I believe that this is a very good indication that the narrative we find in Exodus was written by an eyewitness. Now, this is not the only example. There are other examples that perhaps we can share later, but I just wanted you to know that there is some amazing evidence internally in the Bible itself that argues for the authenticity of the Exodus narrative. If you want to know more about the Exodus, check our website out at epicarchaeology.org. You can click on blog, and we have some really cool blog articles that are about the Exodus and about the timing of the Exodus, and perhaps later we can share some more amazing information of how archaeology illuminates and affirms the biblical narrative.